Get her out of my sight. This is a cockpit for warriors, not a daycare for someone's daughter." The words, sharp and dripping with contempt, echoed through the cavernous simulator bay at Naval Air Station Oceana. The small crowd of technicians and visiting pilots flinched, their nervous laughter a crackle of static in the tense air. Colonel Drake Hartman, a man whose reputation was built on the fading glory of dogfights from a bygone era, stood with his hands on his hips, his barrel chest puffed out like a preening hawk. His gaze was fixed on Technical Sergeant Jordan Hayes, who was performing a final diagnostic on the primary console of the F-35 Lightning simulator. She did not react. Her focus remained on the screen, her fingers moving across the keyboard with a quiet, practiced efficiency that seemed to infuriate the colonel even more. He wanted a reaction, a tear, a protest, anything to validate his dominance. He received only the steady rhythmic click of keys. Frustrated by her silence, a silence he mistook for weakness, he took a step forward. "Did you hear me, Sergeant? I said get out." When she still did not look up, completing the final line of code for the diagnostic, he committed an act that would shatter the bedrock of military decorum. He reached out, grabbed the tightly wound bun of her dark hair, and pulled. It was not a violent yank, but a deliberate, demeaning tug meant to physically turn her head toward him. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." The crowd gasped. The laughter died, replaced by a vacuum of horrified disbelief. But when the visiting four-star admiral, a man named Cassidy Morrison, who had been observing from the shadows of the control room, saw her stance, the way her shoulders did not slump, the way her back remained ramrod straight even as her head was pulled to the side, the way her hands simply came to rest on the console, perfectly still, perfectly calm, he did not see a victim. He saw a weapon. He saw a professional whose composure was forged in fire Hartman could not even imagine. The silence that followed the colonel's egregious act was a physical entity, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound and motion. For a moment, the only movement in the entire high-security facility was the slow, almost imperceptible blink of Jordan Hayes' eyes. Her head was still held at an unnatural angle by Colonel Hartman's grip. His thick fingers tangled in the professionally severe bun of her hair. Yet she did not struggle. She did not cry out. She did not even grant him the satisfaction of meeting his furious gaze. Her own eyes remained fixed on the tactical display of the simulator, her expression a perfect mask of dispassionate neutrality. The onlookers, a mix of seasoned pilots and young enlistees, were frozen in a tableau of shock. They had witnessed tirades before. The military was a pressure cooker, and men like Hartman often let off steam with volcanic verbal eruptions. But this was different. This was a physical violation, a crossing of a line so fundamental that it seemed to destabilize the very air they breathed. Respect for the uniform, for the rank, and for the simple dignity of a fellow service member was the invisible architecture holding their entire world together. And Colonel Hartman had just taken a sledgehammer to a foundational pillar. His face was flushed with a triumphant redness. Believing her stoicism was fear, her silence submission. He was a relic, a man who measured worth in decibels and aggressive posturing. And in Hayes' quiet diligence, he saw only a challenge to his antiquated worldview. He saw the future, a world of complex systems and intellectual warriors, and it terrified him. So he lashed out, grabbing the most visible symbol of her difference, her femininity, her unassuming presence, and tried to subordinate it through brute force. But Admiral Morrison, watching from the elevated observation deck, saw something else entirely. He saw the lack of a flinch. He saw the absolute control in her posture. It was a stillness he had not seen in 20 years. Not since his time with the most elite, most secretive units in the special operations community. It was the calm of a person who has faced true chaos and found it manageable. It was the composure of someone for whom a colonel's temper tantrum was as threatening as a summer breeze. Morrison's aide, a young captain, took a half-step forward ready to intervene, but the admiral put a hand on his arm. A silent command to wait. This was no longer a simple matter of discipline. It had become a test. A demonstration was about to unfold, and Morrison, a connoisseur of quiet competence, was not going to miss it. Hayes slowly, deliberately raised one hand. She did not touch the colonel's hand or try to free herself. Instead, she pressed a single, glowing blue button on the console. A soft chime echoed through the bay. On the main screen, the diagnostic report she had been running flashed green. System calibrated. All parameters nominal. Her job was done. Only then did she turn her head. Not because of his pull, but because she had finished her task. She looked past the colonel, her gaze sweeping over the shocked faces, and finally landed on Admiral Morrison in the control booth. Her eyes, for the briefest of moments, conveyed a message. The system is ready. Then she spoke, her voice level, devoid of tremor or anger. A simple statement of fact directed not at her aggressor, but at the ranking officer in the room. The simulation is ready for the colonel, sir. In that moment, she did not just respond. She took control. She reframed the entire event. His pathetic display of dominance was now just a pointless interruption of her professional duties. The stage was set not for a confrontation, but for a performance, and Colonel Hartman had just volunteered to be the opening act. The colonel, momentarily taken aback by her utter lack of fear and the authoritative finality in her tone, released her hair as if he had been burnt. He scoffed, tried to recover his swagger, and gestured grandly toward the hulking black sphere of the simulator. Finally, he boomed, his voice a little too loud, betraying his unease. Let us see if this billion-dollar video game can handle a real pilot. He strode toward the cockpit hatch, casting a dismissive look back at Hayes, who was now calmly straightening a few loose strands of her hair back into their disciplined bun. Her movements were economical and precise, a stark contrast to the colonel's blustering performance. The simulation scenario had been specifically requested by Admiral Morrison. It was a legendary test, a digital ghost story whispered about by pilots at the Academy. It was called Reaper's Gate. The scenario was designed to be unwinnable. It began with a catastrophic cascading systems failure over the Arctic Ocean, immediately followed by the appearance of multiple next-generation enemy fighters. It was not a test of skill. It was a test of grace under pressure, a psychological evaluation to see how a pilot handled the certainty of failure. No one had ever successfully landed the aircraft in Reaper's Gate simulation. Most crashed within 90 seconds. Colonel Hartman settled into the pilot's seat. The cockpit canopy hissing shut around him. On the massive screens in the control room, the world outside the simulated F-35 came to life. A churning gray sea beneath a sky choked with angry clouds. For a few moments, all was calm. Then the master caution alarm blared to life. A piercing shriek that made the technicians jump. Red lights flashed across Hartman's console like a sudden rash. Multiple engine failure, a synthesized voice announced calmly. Port hydraulic system failure. Navigational systems offline. Hartman's hands flew across the controls, his movements jerky and panicked. He was an analog pilot in a digital storm. He was used to wrestling with a stick and rudder, feeling the feedback of the machine through his spine. This was different. He was fighting ghosts in the code, and he was losing. "Where are my backups?" he yelled, his voice strained over the comms. "Why is not my auxiliary power kicking in?" On the screen, the aircraft began a slow terminal roll. The enemy fighters, previously just distant specks, were now closing in, their icons flashing aggressively on the failing tactical display. He cursed, sweat beading on his forehead, his confident bluster evaporating under the heat of genuine pressure. He pulled back hard on the control stick, a move that would work in his old F-15. But here with the fly-by-wire system crippled, it only exacerbated the spin. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "The simulation is bugged. It is completely unrealistic." Less than a minute after it began, the simulation ended. The screens went black, followed by the cold, emotionless text. "Aircraft lost. Pilot killed in action." A heavy silence fell over the control room once more. The canopy hissed open and Colonel Hartman emerged, his face a mask of fury and embarrassment. "A flawed system," he announced to the room, desperate to deflect the blame. "It is a death trap. No pilot, no matter how skilled, could have survived that. It is a programming error. He glared directly at Hayes. Your machine is broken, Sergeant. Admiral Morrison's voice, calm and amplified by the room's public address system, cut through the tension. Technical Sergeant Hayes. Hayes, who had been observing the entire fiasco with the detached interest of a scientist watching a lab rat fail, a maze straightened. Sir, get in the simulator, the Admiral commanded. A murmur went through the room. Hartman's jaw dropped. Admiral, with all due respect, what is the point? The simulation is fundamentally broken. Sending her in is a waste of time. Morrison ignored him completely. His eyes were locked on Hayes. Run Reaper's Gate. Same parameters. Hayes simply nodded. Yes, sir. She walked toward the simulator, her steps even and measured. She did not look at Hartman or any of the gawking faces. She was a picture of serene focus, an island of calm in a sea of agitated egos. As she passed the colonel, he muttered just loud enough for her to hear. This ought to be good. Do not break a nail. She did not acknowledge him. She simply climbed into the cockpit, her movements fluid and sure, like a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. The canopy closed, sealing her inside the dark sphere. The entire room held its breath. They were about to witness either a repeat of the colonel's embarrassing failure or something they could not yet comprehend. The world outside Hayes's simulated cockpit once again erupted into a maelstrom of digital chaos. The same piercing alarms, the same cascade of red warning lights, the same calm, synthesized voice announcing the beginning of the end. Multiple engine failure, port hydraulic system failure, navigational systems offline. But inside the cockpit, there was no panic. There was only a profound and unnerving calm. Hayes's hands did not fly across the controls. They glided. Her fingers danced over the touch screens and physical buttons with a familiarity that was almost supernatural. Where Hartman had fought the machine, she was communing with it. Her first action shocked the experienced pilots watching in the control room. She did not try to restart the engines. She did not fight the controls. Instead, she deliberately cut power to several non-critical systems, her fingers flicking a sequence of switches in a blur of motion. On the main display, a dozen red warning lights were instantly replaced by amber ones. She was triaging the aircraft's systems, sacrificing limbs to save the heart. What is she doing? Hartman muttered, his arrogance momentarily forgotten, replaced by genuine confusion. She is bleeding the last of the emergency power. She is supposed to be conserving it. But Hayes was not conserving it. She was redirecting it. She shunted the remaining power to a single specific auxiliary control unit that governed the tail stabilizers. It was a procedure so deep in emergency manuals that most pilots did not even know it existed. It was a last-ditch one in a million move. The F-35, which had been in a death spiral, suddenly shuddered. The violent roll ceased. It was still falling, but it was no longer tumbling out of control. It was now a glider, a 40,000-pound aerodynamically unstable glider, but a glider nonetheless. A collective gasp went through the control room. They were witnessing the impossible. She stabilized it. The captain next to Morrison whispered in awe. That is not in the training syllabus. The enemy fighters were now swarming her position, their icons screaming across the tactical display. Without engines, she was a sitting duck. Hartman let out a cynical snort. Okay, so she's a better brick flyer than I am. She's still dead. But Hayes was not looking at the fighters. She was looking at the weather display. A massive storm front was moving in from the north. A wall of turbulence and electromagnetic interference. For any normal pilot, it was a death sentence. For Hayes, it was a tool. She angled the falling jet directly toward the heart of the storm. As she entered the turbulent air, the aircraft began to shake violently. The enemy fighters, reluctant to follow into the tempest, broke off their attack, choosing to wait for her to emerge from the other side. But Hayes had no intention of coming out the other side. Using the violent updrafts within the storm, she began to regain altitude. It was a suicidal maneuver, using the raw power of nature as a substitute for her dead engines. The stress on the airframe was critical. Alarms screamed, but she ignored them, her eyes scanning the terrain data on one of the few functioning screens. She was looking for something, and then she found it. A frozen lake nestled between two mountain peaks, barely long enough to function as a runway. To land there would require a perfect approach with no power, no hydraulics, and in the middle of a blizzard. It was like trying to thread a needle from a mile away during an earthquake. With a final terrifying dive out of the storm clouds, she brought the F-35 into alignment. The ground rushed up to meet her. The control room was utterly silent. Every person present transfixed by the screens. This was not a simulation anymore. It was a masterclass. She executed a perfect dead stick landing. The aircraft touched down on the frozen lake, skidding for thousands of feet in a shower of ice and snow before coming to a stop less than 20 feet from the far edge. The screen went black. Then the text appeared. Aircraft secure. Pilot survived. A beat of silence. Then the control room erupted in a spontaneous burst of applause. Colonel Hartman just stood there, his mouth agape, his face the color of ash. He had not just been proven wrong. He had been shown that he did not even understand the nature of the question. The impossible scenario was not impossible at all. It was just impossible for him. The applause faded into a stunned, reverent silence. The pilots and technicians looked at each other, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. They had just witnessed something that would be told and retold in briefing rooms and bars for years to come. They had seen a ghost story brought to life, a myth made real. The simulator canopy hissed open and Jordan Hayes climbed out. She looked exactly the same as when she had entered. Her hair was still in its perfect bun. Her expression was still calm and unreadable. There was no sign of triumph, no hint of adrenaline. She simply walked back to her console, her job done. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a cue on how to react. They turned their eyes from Hayes to Colonel Hartman, and then finally to Admiral Morrison, who remained on the observation deck. The Admiral's face was unreadable for a long moment. Then he descended the stairs, his deliberate steps echoing in the silent bay. He did not look at Colonel Hartman. He did not acknowledge the assembled crowd. His path was a straight, unwavering line directly to Hayes's workstation. Hartman, seeing the four-star Admiral approaching, seemed to shrink. The blustering arrogance was gone, replaced by the dawning, horrific realization of his career-ending mistake. He had not merely insulted a junior sergeant. He had publicly humiliated her and had been publicly dismantled by her in front of the one man whose opinion could shatter his entire world. He looked like a man awaiting a firing squad. Admiral Morrison stopped directly in front of Hayes, who stood at a respectful position of attention. The two stood in silence for a moment that stretched into an eternity. Morrison was a giant of a man, his chest covered in a rainbow of service ribbons that told the story of a lifetime at the sharp end of American air power. Hayes was small and unassuming, with only the simple blue and silver insignia of a technical sergeant on her sleeve. To an outsider, it was a picture of absolute hierarchical authority. But those in the room knew they were seeing something else entirely. They were seeing a paradigm shift in real time. Morrison's aide, the young captain, hurried to his side holding a tablet. "Admiral, I have her service record pulled up as you requested." Morrison held out a hand, taking the tablet, without ever breaking eye contact with Hayes. He looked down at the screen, his eyes scanning the data. The silence in the room was so profound that the quiet hum of the server racks sounded like a roar. "Let us see," Morrison said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of ultimate authority. He began to read aloud, not loudly, but with a clear, deliberate cadence that ensured every single person in the bay heard every single word. Hayes Jordan, enlisted, current rank technical sergeant. He paused, letting the low rank hang in the air. Hartman seemed to brace himself. Assigned to the 558th Flying Training Squadron as a simulator maintenance technician. Another pause. The Admiral looked up from the tablet, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the room before settling on Colonel Hartman. That is what the cover story says anyway. He looked back down at the tablet. Now for the real file. Accessing Project Phantom. A few of the older technicians gasped. Project Phantom was a rumor, a whisper of a program so classified it was officially denied to exist. It was said to be the bleeding edge of human-machine interface, a place where the lines between pilot and programmer, warrior and engineer were completely erased. The Admiral continued reading, his voice now taking on a staccato, rhythmic power. Subject designation, Phantom 7. Primary role, lead developmental test pilot and systems architect for the F-35 Lightning Advanced Tactical Fighter. The words hit the room like a series of sonic booms. Hartman stumbled back a step, his face turning from ash to a ghostly white. Total flight hours combined live and simulated 24,300. A wave of murmurs rippled through the pilots. That was more flight time than the top 3 most experienced pilots in the room combined. Combat simulations executed 4,812. Success rate 99.2%. The Admiral looked up again, his eyes boring into Hartman. Réparez get scénario, Colonel. Sergeant Hayes did not just fly it. She designed it. She wrote the code. It was her final exam at the end of the Phantom program. She is not just the only person to ever beat it. She's the only one who is ever supposed to. The full, crushing weight of the revelation settled over the room. They were not just looking at a gifted pilot. They were looking at a legend, a ghost, a founding architect of the very future of aerial combat. The final piece of information delivered by Admiral Morrison landed not as a simple fact, but as a judgment. He lowered the tablet and looked directly at Colonel Hartman, his expression one of cold, profound disappointment. "Colonel," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone, "this sergeant who you saw fit to publicly demean and physically assault holds a security clearance that makes yours look like a library card. The technology you dismissed as a video game is something she understands on a molecular level. She does not just operate the future. She builds it." He then turned back to Hayes in a gesture that sent a shock wave through the entire command structure present. Admiral Morrison, a 4-star officer and a living legend, squared his shoulders, brought his hand up in a crisp formal salute, and held it. He was saluting a technical sergeant. It was a complete inversion of military protocol, an act of respect so profound that it transcended rank. It was an acknowledgement of a different kind of hierarchy, not of insignia, but of competence, of mastery. "Ma'am," Admiral Morrison said, the word clear and ringing with sincerity, "your work is exemplary. Thank you for the demonstration." Jordan Hayes for the first time showed a flicker of emotion, a subtle softening around her eyes. She returned the salute with perfect practiced precision. "Thank you, Admiral." The moment was broken. The spell was shattered. The Admiral lowered his hand, gave one last withering look to the utterly broken Colonel Hartman, and turned to leave. "Captain," he said to his aide, "I want Colonel Hartman's full report on my desk by 0800. I want it to include a detailed explanation for his conduct today, and I want his transfer request to the most remote weather station in Alaska attached to it." Without another word, he was gone. The aftermath was a whirlwind of silent activity. The technicians, avoiding eye contact with Hartman, began shutting down the systems. The visiting pilots huddled together, speaking in hushed, awed tones. The legend of Jordan Hayes was already being born, forged in the crucible of that single, stunning moment. Colonel Hartman stood alone in the middle of the room for a long time, a statue of obsolete pride. He was a man who had woken up that morning believing he was a hawk only to discover he was a dinosaur watching the meteor streak across the sky. He had built his identity on a foundation of loud confidence and a belief in the old ways. In the space of 10 minutes, a quiet, unassuming sergeant had demolished that foundation, not with anger or force, but with the undeniable, irrefutable power of pure demonstrated skill. His humiliation was total. Not because he had been punished by a superior, but because he had been rendered irrelevant by his own ignorance. The truth of his inadequacy had been laid bare for all to see. He had picked a fight with the future, and the future had not even condescended to fight back. It had simply demonstrated his obsolescence. As the crowd began to disperse, Hayes finished her work at the console, logged out, and prepared to leave. She packed her small toolkit with the same methodical calm she had displayed all day. Her work was done. The system was calibrated. The lesson had been taught. Her silence had spoken more eloquently and more devastatingly than any shout ever could. As she walked toward the exit, one of the young pilots, a fresh-faced lieutenant, stepped in her path. He looked nervous, but his eyes shone with a newfound respect. "Sergeant," he stammered. "Ma'am, I have never seen anything like it." Hayes paused and looked at him. She offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Focus on the problem, not the noise," she said, her voice quiet. "The machine tells you everything you need to know. You just have to be calm enough to listen." And with that piece of profound advice, the architect of the future walked out of the simulator bay, leaving behind a shattered ego, a dozen newly humbled pilots, and the first chapter of a story that would become a legend. Her legacy was not in the spectacular flight. It was in the quiet principle she embodied, that respect is a currency earned not by the rank on your collar, but by the competence in your hands. The story of what happened in Simulator Bay spread through Naval Air Station Oceana like a flash fire. It traveled through encrypted channels, hushed conversations in the mess hall, and late-night talks in the barracks. It was a story too perfect to remain secret. A modern military fable with a clear villain, an unassuming hero, and a moment of vindication so pure it felt scripted. By the next day, everyone from the gate guards to the command staff knew the name Jordan Hayes. The narrative, as it was passed along, began to acquire the burnished glow of myth. Details were embellished. In some versions, she had landed the crippled F-35 with her eyes closed. In others, she had reprogrammed the simulation's physics engine mid-flight. But the core elements remained unchanged. The arrogant colonel, the demeaning insult, the impossible challenge, the silent triumph, and the four-star admiral salute. The incident became a cultural touchstone on the base, a shorthand for the eternal conflict between old guard arrogance and new wave competence. A new phrase entered the local lexicon. When a younger airman demonstrated a surprising level of technical skill, an older non-commissioned officer might nod slowly and say, "Be careful, you are about to get hazed." It meant to be so thoroughly outclassed by a subordinate that your own authority becomes a punchline. The most significant ripple effect, however, was the change in Colonel Hartman. As ordered, he submitted his report. It was said to be a document stripped of all bluster, a stark and honest account of his own prejudice and failure. He did not make excuses. He did not blame the machine. He detailed his actions, including grabbing Hayes's hair, and formally stated that his conduct was unbecoming of an officer. He accepted full responsibility. His request for a transfer to Eielson Air Base in Alaska was approved the same day. But before he left, he did one last thing. He found Jordan Hayes as she was performing maintenance on an avionics rack. He approached her alone, without the audience of the simulator bay. The few technicians who saw the interaction from a distance noted that the once booming colonel seemed smaller. His posture stooped. He stood before her, and in a quiet, humbled voice, he apologized, not just for the insult, but for his ignorance. He told her he had been wrong, that he had let his pride and fear of obsolescence cloud his judgment. He told her she had taught him a lesson he should have learned decades ago. Hayes listened patiently, her expression neutral. When he was finished, she simply said, "Apology accepted, Colonel. Everyone has a bad day." It was a gesture of profound grace, an act of quiet magnanimity that was in its own way as powerful as her performance in the simulator.